Today we're going to look at Chapter 1, Concept 1, Linear Translations and Basic Vocabulary. So in order for us to translate phrases from English into math and from math into English, there are a few things that we need to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as our vocabulary is concerned. So let's take a look. The first thing we need to understand is, what is an algebraic expression? Algebra is different. So when we refer to algebraic expressions, what is it that we're talking about? This is anytime you have a sum and or a product. And remember, sum just means things are being added together, and a product just means that they're being multiplied together. Well, what's being added and multiplied? It can be numbers and variables. Remember, variables is what makes algebra so interesting at this stage of the game. So, of course, it's going to be dealing with variables. But it's the two of them together. So I have an example here for you. 2x plus 4y squared is an example of an algebraic expressions. We have numbers, we have variables, they're being added and multiplied together. So that's what this is, an algebraic expression. But we can break it down into even smaller parts, which we call terms. So what is a term? A term can be a couple of different things. It can be just a number. It can be a variable. So it can be just one number or just one variable, or it can be the product, which means multiply, the product or quotient, which means divide, and it can be with numbers and variables together. So it can be the product of a number and variable or the quotient of a number and a variable. That's a term. So in this example, 2x is a term, 4y squared is a term. So that's what we're referring to when we do that. Let's take a look a little bit more at this 4y squared term, because it looks kind of funky. It's got this smaller number here, this 2. That's what we call a power. Another word for power is exponent. And it'll be those small numbers that are raised up a bit. The other thing that you'll need to know is the base, the larger number that's a little bit lower down. Just like the base of a lamp is called the base. So it's the lower number, the lower, bigger number. And it's usually a variable. Doesn't have to be, but it usually is. Okay, so y is our base here. And it's not the whole thing. Notice I didn't circle 4y, it's just y. It's just the part that's attached to the exponent. So powers and bases go together. Now let's take a look at 2x. What if we break that down into its smaller parts and pieces? We call those factors. Factors are quantities that are being multiplied together. Multiplied together. Anytime you have stuff that's being multiplied together, they're called factors. For example, if you have the number 4, well, what can I multiply together to get 4? I can do 1 times 4, so 1 and 4 are factors. I can do 2 times 2, so 2 and 2 are factors, factors of 4. What if it has a variable? What if it's 2 times x, like our example here? Well, if I ask myself, what two things are being multiplied together in this example? 2 is being multiplied by x. So the factors are 2 and x. So that takes care of the individual parts and pieces of an algebraic expression. But how do we know how to connect those parts and pieces? That's where this linear translation section comes into play. We have words that we use for addition, for subtraction, for multiplication, for division, and for powers. Key words and phrases that help us know what math notation we should be using when we're translating an algebraic expression. So let's take a look at some examples. And this is not at all an inclusive list that has all of them. It's just a list to get you started. So for addition, you might see the sum of two things. Or you might see the phrase added to. Or you might see increased by. These are all phrases that mean addition. But there's one tricky one that I want you to be aware of, and that is more than. And if you have one, I want you to highlight that phrase, more than. because it's a very tricky one. Anytime you see the word than, and I'm going to circle it in a different color. Anytime you see the word than, you are going to reverse the order of the two parts and pieces that are being added together. And we'll take a look at what that means in a little bit, but I want you to remember more than is a tricky one. What are some subtraction words? Well, we have the difference of, that's a subtraction word. You might have, what are some more? You might have subtracted from. You might have less than, and that's another tricky one, so be careful with those. Less than is the tricky one, so we're going to go ahead and highlight that and remember that because we see that word than, the order is going to be reversed when we use that to translate. What about for multiplication? Multiplication, you might see the product of, you might see times. Those are a couple of examples for that. For division, you might see quotient of or divided by. And then let's talk about powers. We're not going to be using a whole ton of powers, so don't get freaked out. But there are a couple that come up pretty frequently, and they're pretty standard, and I want you to be familiar with them. And those are squared, and that just means 2 as an exponent, because remember powers are exponents, and cubed. That's an exponent of 3. Okay, so just like squared, but with a 3. That's cubed. So let's take a look at how we're going to be using these phrases with these practice problems down here. You'll see that the instructions say, write each as an algebraic expression. And there's actually some down here that we're going to write as an English expression. We're going to translate them from math into English. But let's grab a pencil, just in case we make some mistakes, and take a look. But before we dive in, what I want you to do is pause the video, and I want you to go through and I want you to highlight any keywords that we've just been talking about that you see. Go ahead and do that now. Let's take a look at some of these together. Let's say V increased by 7. Well, increased by is an addition word, so I can take V and 7 and add them together. 5 less than 16. Oh, there's that tricky word, than, which means to reverse the order. So instead of starting with 5, I'm going to start with 16. And then less than is a subtraction word, so 16 minus 5. What about 6 more than? Oh, more than is an addition word, but it's a tricky one, so I'm going to reverse the order. Starting with W, add it together with 6. Why don't you take a look at 4 and 5 and see if you can get those on your own. Did you get them? Twice x just means 2 times x, because I have x 2 times. I have it twice. 5 cubed is the 5 as the base with the power or an exponent of 3, because that's what cubed means. What if we're working from a math expression and we're translating that into an English expression? It works the same way, you're just going to work backwards. So 2m, whenever two things are right next to each other like that, where there's no symbol at all, it means that they're being multiplied. So I have 2 and m being multiplied together. So I'm going to look up here to my multiplication words and pick one. It doesn't really matter which. So I'm going to do 2 times m. For this number 7, I have a 1/3 and a y, and they're right next to each other, which means they're being multiplied. So I'm going to use my other multiplication phrase because I haven't used it yet. And I'm going to say the product of 1/3 and y, which means that those two things are being multiplied together. Let's take a look at just a few more. Twice 5. Well, that means I have 5 twice, so I can write that as 2 times 5. And in algebra, we use this little dot for multiplication. Or you can use an x, but x becomes a variable, so it gets very tricky. The dot's the best way to go. Then for number 9, we have the quotient of 50 and 5. Quotient is a division word, so I'm going to take 50 divided by 5. And that sets me up for that one. Why don't you take the rest of your time tonight for homework and finish the rest of these examples 10 through 21. Bring them to class tomorrow and be ready to discuss them with your group and with me. And if you have any trouble, we'll be sure to take a look at them together.